The courtroom buzzed with the faint hum of activity as Judge Samuel Whittaker adjusted his spectacles and glanced at the docket for the next case. He was known throughout the county for his strict adherence to rules. A man who believed the law was the ultimate equalizer. He had seen thousands of faces pass through his courtroom, and most blended together in an endless blur of routine violations. As he called the next case, the doors at the back of the courtroom opened, and Angela Carter stepped in. She walked with a measured calm, her head held high, and a quiet determination in her eyes. She was dressed neatly in a forest green blouse and jeans, a choice that set her apart from the typical polished attire of most who stood before the judge. Judge Whittaker barely noticed the difference. He was focused on the facts before him. Angela Carter, the charge is illegal parking in a restricted area near the Clover Valley Nature Reserve on the morning of June 3rd. The tone of his voice was firm and impersonal. Angela stepped forward, her hands clasped in front of her, and her voice was steady as she responded, "Yes, Your Honor, I understand the charge. But before I explain, I want to say that the parking was unintentional." Judge Whittaker cut her off abruptly. "I appreciate your statement, but the restricted area is clearly marked. Signs are posted, and the law must be upheld to protect these spaces against misuse," he said, without lifting his gaze from the papers in front of him. Angela nodded quietly, letting him finish. "The fine for this infraction is $300 and must be paid within 30 days, he concluded, ready to move to the next case. But as Angela stepped back, she spoke softly under her breath, almost to herself. "It wasn't intentional. I was helping an injured hawk." The words landed like a pebble in a still pond, catching the attention of Judge Whittaker. He paused his gavel midair, and for the first time, he looked directly at her. Her expression was calm, but there was a flicker of something more, an unspoken conviction that intrigued him. The courtroom was silent for a brief moment before he cleared his throat. "That will be all, Miss Carter. You may proceed to the clerk for payment." Angela nodded again, this time turning toward the exit. Her steps were deliberate, not rushed, as though she carried no shame for being in court. The judge watched her leave, his curiosity briefly distracting him, before he resumed his duties, calling the next name on the docket. But for the rest of the session, Judge Whittaker found himself returning to that single moment. Why had she mentioned the hawk, and why with such quiet certainty? Was it an excuse to soften her case, or was there truth behind it? He had heard plenty of reasons from defendants, but this one lingered in his mind long after she had left. That evening, as the courthouse emptied and Judge Whittaker sat at his desk reviewing files, he found himself searching her name online. He didn't know what he expected to find, but curiosity drove him forward, and within moments, he stumbled upon a community blog post featuring Angela Carter holding a magnificent hawk, its wing carefully bandaged in her hands. The caption read, "Local wildlife advocate Angela Carter rescues injured bird from Clover Valley Reserve." And suddenly the case didn't feel so routine anymore. Judge Samuel Whittaker sat at his desk long after the courthouse had emptied. The rhythmic tick of the clock, the only sound in the room. He tapped his pen absent-mindedly against the edge of a legal pad, the image of Angela Carter and the injured hawk refusing to leave his mind. It wasn't like him to dwell on a case once it was settled, but something about her demeanor and the quiet confidence with which she spoke lingered in his thoughts. Her name wasn't unfamiliar to the judge as he typed it into the search bar of his computer, but it felt strange for him to do so. He prided himself on remaining detached, impartial, focused on the law, yet here he was curiosity gnawing at him. The first few search results were unremarkable news articles about local events and a few social media profiles, but then he stumbled upon a community blog post that caught his attention. The title read, "Wildlife Advocate Rescues Injured Animals." Across the region, he clicked on it, and there was Angela Carter standing in the middle of a wooded area, holding a hawk with a carefully bandaged wing. The bird looked regal, even in its fragile state, and Angela's expression was one of determination. The article detailed Angela's work with local wildlife groups, describing her as a tireless advocate for injured and endangered animals. It mentioned how she often went out of her way to rescue creatures in distress, sometimes traveling for hours to respond to calls from concerned residents. Her efforts had saved countless animals from suffering, giving them a second chance at life. The blog even shared testimonials from people who had witnessed her work firsthand. Judge Whittaker leaned back in his chair, his mind racing. He had assumed she was just another defendant with a mundane excuse for breaking the rules, but now he felt a pang of regret. He thought about the fine he had issued without allowing her to explain herself fully. Was it justified under the law? Yes, but had he done justice to her story, to her circumstances? He wasn't so sure. He continued reading, clicking through more articles and posts. He discovered pictures of Angela cradling an injured fox, leading a frightened deer away from a busy highway, and kneeling beside a beaver that had been trapped in debris. Each image seemed to tell a story of compassion and resilience. The more he learned, the more his curiosity grew. Who was Angela Carter? Really, what drove her to dedicate so much of her time to helping creatures that many people would overlook or ignore? And what did she think when she stood before him in court, reduced to just another case number? The next morning, Judge Whittaker arrived at the courthouse earlier than usual. His mind was already set. He asked his clerk to contact Angela Carter and request her presence in his chambers. It was an unusual move for him, one he couldn't fully justify even to himself. But he knew he needed to hear more from her, not as a defendant, but as a person. When the message was relayed to Angela, she hesitated at first. She wasn't sure why the judge would want to see her again, especially after their brief interaction in court, but her curiosity matched his, and eventually she agreed to the meeting. By the time Angela walked into his chambers later that week, Judge Whittaker had prepared himself for a conversation unlike any he had ever had before. Angela Carter walked into the judge's chambers with a sense of cautious curiosity. She wasn't entirely sure why Judge Whittaker had called her back, but she was willing to hear him out. The room was a stark contrast to the bustling courtroom. It was quiet, lined with bookshelves, overflowing with legal texts and papers neatly stacked on the desk. Judge Whittaker stood as she entered, gesturing toward a chair opposite him. "Thank you for agreeing to meet with me," he began, his tone softer than it had been in the courtroom. Angela nodded and sat down, her posture relaxed, but her eyes alert. "I'll admit this isn't something I normally do, but after our last encounter, I felt I needed to understand more about what brought you to the nature reserve that day." Angela tilted her head, slightly surprised by his candor. "Well, Your Honor, I didn't expect this, but I'm happy to explain. I volunteer with a local wildlife rescue group." She said, her voice steady and clear. "That day, I got a call about an injured hawk near Clover Valley. Someone found it struggling near the road and called us for help." She paused briefly, gauging his reaction. Judge Whittaker leaned forward, listening intently. "Please continue," he said. Angela's voice grew more animated as she recounted the events. "When I arrived, the hawk had a broken wing. It was weak and disoriented. I didn't have time to think about where I parked. I just grabbed my equipment and focused on stabilizing the bird. Once it was safe, I realized I had parked in a restricted zone, but by then the citation had already been issued." The judge nodded, absorbing her words. He had seen people justify their actions in his courtroom countless times, but Angela's explanation felt different. There was no defensiveness in her tone, no attempt to evade responsibility. She simply stated the facts with a quiet conviction. "Your work sounds extraordinary, but also challenging," Judge Whittaker said, his voice carrying a note of genuine curiosity. "What motivates you to dedicate so much of your time to this?" Angela's face softened, and she smiled slightly. "Growing up, I always felt a connection to animals. They don't have a voice to advocate for themselves, so I decided to be that voice for them. It started small, helping stray cats and injured birds around my neighborhood, but over time, it grew into something bigger. Now I work with organizations to rescue, rehabilitate, and release wildlife back into their natural habitats." Her passion was evident in every word. Judge Whittaker found himself unexpectedly moved by her dedication. "I must admit, I didn't fully appreciate the context of your case when I made my ruling," he said carefully. "The law is important, of course, but so is understanding the people it affects." Angela regarded him for a moment before responding. "I appreciate you saying that, Your Honor. I don't hold any resentment for the fine. The reserve's rules exist to protect the environment, and I understand that. I just wish I had been given the chance to explain." Judge Whittaker felt a twinge of regret. He had prided himself on being impartial, but he realized now that impartiality without understanding could sometimes lead to missed opportunities for compassion. He straightened in his chair. Angela, I'd like to learn more about your work. If you're willing, I'd like to see it firsthand. Perhaps I could accompany you on one of your rescue missions. Angela raised her eyebrows in surprise. For a moment, she wasn't sure if he was serious. But as she looked into his eyes, she saw sincerity. She nodded slowly. All right, Your Honor. If you're really interested, I have a call tomorrow about an injured fox. You're welcome to join. And with that, an unlikely partnership began. The following morning, Judge Samuel Whittaker found himself standing outside a modest brick house in a quiet neighborhood. His hands were tucked into the pockets of his jacket, and a cool breeze rustled the leaves in the nearby trees. He felt out of place here among the casual clothes and the unpolished reality of a wildlife rescue mission, but he was determined to follow through on his word. Angela Carter arrived shortly after in her usual practical attire, boots, jeans, and a weather jacket. She gave him a brief smile as she pulled up in her truck loaded with equipment. So you made it, she said, stepping out of the vehicle ready to begin. Whittaker nodded. On here. As promised, he wasn't sure what to expect from the day, but something about the look in her eyes told him this wasn't just about witnessing a rescue, it was about understanding her world the way she saw it. Angela handed him a set of gloves and a mask. Here, she said, this will keep you safe and protect the animal. Once you're ready, we'll head out. She was efficient and organized, and though she didn't speak much, her actions spoke volumes. They made their way to the edge of a nearby wooded area where a concerned homeowner had called about an injured fox. Angela had been in contact with the owner the night before, and now she was heading toward a small makeshift pen in the back of the yard where the fox had been temporarily housed. The animal was nervous but manageable, its leg injured by a trap. It had been struggling to move for hours, but Angela was calm as she approached. It's all right, she said, her voice low and soothing. The fox wasn't used to being around humans, but it sensed her gentle presence and allowed her to get closer. Whittaker stood back, observing the quiet exchange between woman and animal. He had expected chaos or frantic energy. Instead, there was a stillness, a peace that seemed to emanate from Angela. As she worked, he watched as she gently examined the fox's leg, assessing the damage before moving swiftly to apply a bandage and splint. You know what you're doing, he said quietly, his voice tinged with admiration. It was not just the technique, but the care she took in each movement, the patience she gave to an animal who would never understand her language, but somehow understood her intentions. Angela nodded without looking up. She's lucky she's alive, she said softly. As she worked, the fox had been trapped for hours without food or water. It was a miracle it hadn't gone into shock. After a few moments, she stood up, brushing off her hands and turning toward Whittaker. Okay, she said with a slight grin. It's your turn. She handed him a syringe filled with a sedative and showed him how to administer it to the fox to help it stay calm during the rest of the procedure. Whittaker hesitated for a moment before following her instructions. He was nervous, but Angela's steady confidence put him at ease. The fox remained still, its breathing slow and steady as Whittaker followed her guidance. When it was over, Angela carefully placed the fox into a travel crate and closed the door with a soft click. That's it, she said. We'll take her to the clinic to get checked out, and then we'll release her once she's healed. Judge Whittaker stood back watching her. As she loaded the fox into the truck, he couldn't help but be moved by the scene. The tenderness, the care, the way Angela seemed to be an embodiment of everything he had dismissed in his courtroom so many years. I've never seen anything quite like this, he admitted. You didn't just save her, you gave her hope. Angela turned to him with a knowing smile. It's what we do, she said, and we do it because we believe every life matters. Over the next few weeks, Judge Samuel Whittaker found himself reflecting on the day he spent with Angela Carter in the woods. It was an experience unlike any he had ever encountered in his career. The quiet compassion with which she treated the injured fox had struck a chord within him. He had been prepared for a quick and clinical interaction, but instead, he had witnessed something more profound, the connection between a person and the animal they were trying to save. His days at the courthouse resumed as usual, but there was a shift in his perspective. With each case he began to see the individuals before him with new eyes, the rigid lines between right and wrong blurred as he remembered the fox and Angela's care. and how her actions had been guided not by legalities, but by a deep sense of responsibility to the world around her. He began to question his own approach to justice. Was it enough to simply follow the law, or was there a deeper understanding of fairness he had been overlooking? Angela had invited him to join her on more rescue missions, and he accepted every time. In the weeks that followed, they worked together to save a variety of animals, from owls trapped in fences to birds injured by traffic to a deer that had wandered into a busy road. In every instance, Whittaker saw firsthand the care and skill Angela brought to her work. It wasn't just about the animals, it was about preserving the balance of life in a world that often seemed to forget that. Each mission took them into different parts of the region, and Whittaker was struck by the diversity of people who called on Angela for help, from farmers whose livestock had been threatened by wild animals to children who had found injured pets in their backyards. Everyone seemed to respect and admire Angela's ability to care for both the animals and the community she served. It wasn't long before Whittaker found himself questioning his role in the courtroom too. He had always prided himself on being fair, but he had realized that fairness wasn't always about applying the law to every situation. Sometimes it was about understanding the circumstances and offering solutions that were more meaningful than punishment. One day, as they drove back from a rescue mission, Angela turned to him with a thoughtful expression. "I've been meaning to ask you something," she said. "What made you agree to come along that first time?" Whittaker glanced at her briefly before responding. "I suppose I was curious," he admitted. "I wanted to understand why you do what you do. But I think I'd also wanted to understand you better. I wasn't sure I had all the facts. When I find you, I realized I was just doing my job without considering who you were or what your intentions were." Angela smiled, but it was a knowing smile. "There's a lot of assumptions we all make," she said. "You'd be surprised how often people judge others by what they see on the surface." Whittaker nodded in agreement. "It's something I'm learning more about every day." A silence passed between them as they drove through the countryside. The road stretched out before them, the landscape bathed in the warm light of the afternoon sun. And in that moment, Whittaker felt a deep sense of connection, not just to Angela, but to the work they were doing together. It wasn't just about animals. It was about bridging the gap between two very different worlds and finding a way to make them both better. The days began to blend together for Judge Samuel Whittaker and Angela Carter as they continued their partnership in wildlife rescue and rehabilitation. They worked side by side as Angela shared her knowledge with Whittaker, and he in turn brought his legal expertise into the fold. They began to see the world through each other's eyes. Angela saw the intricacies of the law as a tool for justice, but one that often lacked empathy, while Whittaker began to view wildlife conservation not just as a cause, but as a reflection of the broader human experience. One afternoon, as they sat in a small cafe after a long day of rescuing an injured deer, Angela turned to him with a thoughtful expression. "There's something I've been meaning to ask," she said. "What if you had to apply what you've learned here to your work in the courtroom? How would you handle a case differently?" Whittaker paused for a moment as the question hung in the air. He had been pondering that very idea in recent weeks, seeing the potential for change in the way he approached his cases. But it wasn't an easy thing to reconcile. He had spent his career in a world of rules and procedures where discretion was often seen as a weakness. "I think I'd approach it with more understanding," he said slowly. "I would take the time to really listen to the context of each case. It's not enough to simply follow the law anymore. I've seen too many situations where a person is punished for something that might not deserve punishment. Maybe the law could be more flexible if we understood the reasons behind the actions." Angela nodded approvingly. "That's a good start," she said. "A lot of times people are punished for circumstances they didn't create. Sometimes they just need help or a chance to make things right, not a fine or a prison sentence." They sat in silence for a while, both deep in thought. Before long, Whittaker broke the quiet. "So what if I could help you more with your cause? What if I could use my position to advocate for wildlife preservation or to bring awareness to the challenges you face?" Angela's eyes lit up with surprise. "You'd be willing to do that?" she asked. "You'd speak out for animals like the ones we rescue?" Whittaker smiled. "It's funny how much I've learned from this whole experience. I never imagined that a simple parking violation could lead to something like this. But it's about more than just the animals. It's about creating a world where we recognize our responsibility to all living creatures and to each other. Angela smiled back. I think you could make a real difference. She said the law is a powerful tool, and it can be used to create real change if it's applied thoughtfully and with compassion. And so began a new chapter in their unlikely partnership. They began meeting with local conservation groups, organizing community outreach events, and advocating for stronger protections for wildlife. The collaboration between Angela's grassroots efforts and Whittaker's legal influence began to take shape. They worked together on educational campaigns about responsible wildlife interactions and began hosting events at schools to teach children the importance of protecting their natural environment. Their efforts didn't go unnoticed. As word spread about their work together, local media outlets took interest, and the story of an unlikely alliance between a strict judge and a passionate wildlife advocate captured the public's attention. Journalists reached out to both of them for interviews, and their story quickly became a symbol of how compassion and understanding could transcend divisions. One evening, as they prepared for a public event to promote their new initiative, Angela turned to Whittaker with a smile. "You know, you've come a long way," she said. Whittaker chuckled. "I suppose I have." And so had their shared mission. Both had learned from the other, and together they were forging a path that might inspire others to see the world a little differently. As the weeks passed, the collaboration between Judge Samuel Whittaker and Angela Carter began to take on a life of its own. Their efforts to raise awareness for wildlife conservation gained momentum with each passing event. The community's response was overwhelmingly positive. People were drawn to their story of an unlikely partnership between a man of the law and a woman who dedicated her life to protecting animals. The media buzzed with interviews and articles celebrating their work together. But with growing attention came new challenges. The pair had to navigate a mix of praise and criticism. Some questioned Whittaker's role in advocating for wildlife. Others felt uncomfortable with the idea of a judge becoming involved in what some saw as a niche cause. For Angela, it was another reminder of how difficult it could be to change hearts and minds. But she remained undeterred. She knew the importance of their mission and refused to let detractors slow them down. One evening, as they sat in Whittaker's office discussing the next community event, Angela looked over at him. "You're handling this much better than I thought you would," she said teasingly. Whittaker raised an eyebrow. "Oh, really, and why's that?" Angela smiled. "You've never been one to bend the rules, and now you're helping us challenge the status quo a little bit. It's not every day that the judge steps out of the courtroom and starts working with a wildlife advocate." Whittaker leaned back in his chair with a thoughtful expression. "Maybe I've always been too rigid in my thinking," he said. "There's more to life than just enforcing the law. Sometimes doing the right thing means stepping outside the box." Angela nodded. "I get that too. It's one of the reasons I started doing this in the first place. I saw animals suffering, and I couldn't just sit back and let things stay the same. I had to do something." Whittaker looked at her with respect. "I admire that it's not easy to go against the grain, especially when you're doing something that requires so much patience and perseverance." Angela smiled. "You're not so different from me, you know. That's why this partnership works. You both care about what's right, and you're willing to make the effort." Their conversation was interrupted by a knock on the door, and a young intern from the local wildlife rescue organization stepped in. She handed Angela a folder and smiled. "We just got an update on the fox from last month. It's fully healed and ready to be released back into the wild." Angela's face lit up with excitement. "That's great news," she said, turning to Whittaker. "Looks like you get to see the end result of your work." Whittaker stood up from his chair, a feeling of accomplishment settling over him. He had never imagined that something as simple as helping an animal could bring so much satisfaction. But now he understood why Angela did it. Day in and day out, the fox release would be a celebration, not just for the animal, but for all of the lives they had touched. The following weekend, they made the trip to the wooded area near Clover Valley, where Angela had rescued the fox just weeks before. They stood together watching as the fox slowly emerged from its crate. Its body strong and free of injury. For the first time in weeks, it sniffed the air and then bolted into the underbrush, disappearing into the forest. Angela turned to Whittaker with a proud smile. "You did it." Whittaker felt a warmth in his chest watching the fox disappear into the wild. He knew he had played a small part in its recovery, But it was Angela who had made it all possible. Her dedication and compassion had saved a life. Maybe the law wasn't all that mattered after all. Maybe sometimes the best thing you could do was offer a second chance. The Fox of Release was a moment of triumph, not just for Angela Carter and Judge Samuel Whittaker, but for everyone who had worked alongside them in their shared mission. It wasn't just about saving an individual animal anymore. It was about the ripple effect of their actions and the way those actions were beginning to inspire change in the community. They had shown people that compassion for animals wasn't just a matter of charity, it was an essential part of preserving the natural world. In the weeks that followed, their success stories continued to spread from school children learning about wildlife conservation to local businesses supporting wildlife-friendly practices. More and more people became involved in their cause. Angela and Whittaker's efforts had ignited a movement, one that was slowly but surely changing the way people thought about wildlife and the environment. At the courthouse, Whittaker began to implement the lessons he had learned through his work with Angela. He started to approach cases with a deeper understanding of the individuals before him. Each person had a story that extended beyond the legal details, and he realized that taking the time to understand those stories was part of his responsibility. As a judge, he became more focused on restorative justice, finding ways to help those in his courtroom make amends without resorting to harsh punishment. As his approach evolved, the courthouse staff and local community took notice. He began to speak at local events, not only about his new approach to justice, but also about the importance of environmental advocacy. He used his position to push for policies that would protect wildlife and support sustainable practices, even proposing changes to local laws that would help prevent harm to vulnerable species. Angela watched from the sidelines with pride. She had known all along that Whittaker was more than just a judge, but seeing him embrace these changes was something else entirely. He had become a true ally for wildlife conservation, and his influence was helping bring about the changes they both wanted to see. But beyond the public accolades and the recognition, what mattered most to Angela was the way their work had impacted their own lives. They had built a partnership rooted in mutual respect and shared values, and that connection had become as important as their mission to protect wildlife. Whittaker had stepped into a world that was foreign to him, and in doing so, he had not only saved animals, he had saved a part of himself. One evening, as they sat together at a community gathering celebrating their most recent rescue, Whittaker turned to Angela with a thoughtful expression. "You know, I never would have imagined any of this when I fined you for that parking violation," he said. "It's strange how life works sometimes." Angela laughed softly. "Yeah, I know what you mean. It's funny how one small moment can change everything. We didn't know then where we'd end up. But I think we've both learned a lot since that day." Whittaker nodded. "I've learned that true justice isn't just about enforcing the law. It's about seeing the bigger picture. It's about finding ways to heal and to help even when the law doesn't have all the answers. And it's about second chances," Angela added with a smile. Whittaker smiled back. "Yes, second chances." They looked around the room at the group of people who had gathered to support their cause, and for the first time in a long while, Whittaker felt content with the direction his life had taken. He had found a purpose beyond the courtroom, one that connected him to a greater mission. He knew he would continue to make mistakes and face challenges, but he also knew he had made the right choice by opening his heart to the possibility of change. And as Angela looked at him with a knowing smile, she too understood that sometimes the greatest rewards came from the unexpected journeys, the ones that led to second chances for everyone.